Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I am your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Now let's get into it. Today's topic is the places of your world. This is an important topic. It's really talking about basic astronomy from your world out into your universe and the physical geometry of the planet itself. And I talked about this a little bit in the last episode. However, this is going to be a little bit more detail on the kinds of things I think about. It's what you can see, especially with the naked eye, and depending on the tech level, whatever technology or magic, the distance that allows you to see extra, you have to account for those objects. So if you can see other planets with the naked eye, moons around other planets, the sun you could probably see. If not, your world's in a lot of trouble. Those are the things that are important. Is there a nebula that is close enough in space that you can see it at night, the sort of gaseous colors? Technically, scientifically, I'm not so sure if you're close enough to a nebula that you'd be able to see it in the night sky. However, at least not with a naked eye, you might be able to, in much the same way you can see a fluorescent light. It's a hard signal that kind of comes at you, so you might be able to see it in a fashion. It probably wouldn't be as beautiful as it is far away when you sort of magnify the light and then concentrate it onto something that we do now to create images. The cosmos is very important because especially in early cultures, they're trying to explain the world and universe in a way that will make them survive a little bit better, make them get ahead. And so if they know through the moon cycles when the planting seasons are going to come or go, Game of Thrones wise, is winter coming? Does the world warn you of that? As in Game of Thrones, something that some people seem to know, and other people are less certain of when and where it's coming. But that's why the cosmos is important, because typically, whenever they have stories to explain stuff like that, it ends up as part of a religion. It's kind of where you get the gods in space and, with Ares and stuff like that, because it was the Greeks trying to give a name to something that was important to them. Because when Ares could be seen or behind the sun, it meant something very important to them. And those things can evolve over time, however, they're important to know. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are oceans. Oceans, the way I'm defining them, are bodies of water that surround land. So in a world where you have more land than water, you might not have oceans the way I define them, but I like to know where they are. Usually if you want more life, you probably more water than land. So more than likely you'll have at least 51% of your world being water. However, you might want an arid world. You might want a Dantooine. So you can do that as you want to, but when I say oceans, I like to think of oceans as in water that surrounds land. And then the land, the thing I like to think about are plate tectonics. Does your continents move? Where is their current position when you want to tell the stories? I don't think too much about this, but it will make an impact if you think about the geology of your world. You might have similar rock formations in two places separated by an ocean than in two places on the same continent if they've ripped apart. For my world, for example, something cataclysmic happened, which is either greatly reduced or have stopped plate tectonics. It's kind of hardened the surface a bit. And that will have consequences down the road. I don't know if that's scientifically possible. I don't really care. But my landmass does not rip apart over time or crush. It's kind of stopped to where it's at, which means it's going to weather over time. Now, mountains and the coastlines are the next most important things. So where is the extent of your land go? Where do the mountain ranges go? Do they go underwater and on land or on both? Mountains are very important because they oftentimes will signify dry to wet areas. If you have a big mountain range, storms hit them, it will literally pull away all of the moisture. And so the other side will typically be more arid. And weather patterns kind of get involved into that as well too. Plains, where the flatter areas. Now, there's never truly flat, or very rarely truly flat areas or areas without hills, but to me, it's an area that the predominant feature is closer to a certain sea level. Even if it's a plateau, a big plateau that's 1,000 meters up, if it covers half your world, that's really a plain on top of the plateau. It's just at a different elevation than most plains around the coast are going to be very close to sea level. Steppes, another something typically a little bit drier than plains. Typically have those in large land masses because they typically are a bit more arid. Even when the rain will come in, it will just keep washing away. So they don't store water typically as well. And a lot of times they'll surround deserts. So like we have a lot of steppes in Central Asia because it's a big land mass and it can support those kind of terrains. Deserts, I don't think of deserts as sand. They might or might not be. They're likely to be if they get a lot of sun. However, deserts are simply areas that get very, very little rainfall annually. Like on Earth, Antarctica is a desert because it gets very little new precipitation every year. However, it has a bunch of snow and ice on it because it's so cold that the little it gets, it stores. So don't think of deserts as in a sandy place in Arabia. They might or might not be. It's just an area that does not get a lot of rain. And then depending on the other environmental conditions will dictate whether it's sand or whether it's broken hilly land or whether it's like a frozen area. Now rivers typically are the way mountains drain into the ocean. And it could be directly or indirectly. There could be evaporation. There's a bunch of things that play into that. But rivers are very important. And the other thing too is the depth and ability for ships to move up and down rivers. So you can have small, thin rivers that are very impassable by ships. Cultures located in areas like that probably will have very weak boating technology. If they ever reach coast through conquest, they're going to struggle with what to do there because they're not going to know how to build vessels that work on the ocean. Now, on the other hand, if you take a look at Europe, there's a lot of deep channels. There's a lot of deep channels in their rivers. And these allow bigger ships to sail into places like Paris in the old days, or even worse for the French and the English and a lot of Europe, where the Vikings could sail down them in their ships and then attack people from the rivers. So the big channels will allow transportation from the ocean inland. And those kind of rivers are typically very important because trade can happen very far without having to do a lot of changes if it exists that way. And if you want the trade to be controlled by a city, they have to figure out what to do to either block off or protect the river to prevent ships from going there that don't have the permission. Lakes are just fresh water that is surrounded by land. And then seas are salt water surrounded by land, or largely surrounded by land, like the Mediterranean Sea. I would call the Mediterranean Sea in my definitions because it is largely surrounded by land. The Caribbean Sea is a division. It's largely outside of the scope of land. I would not consider that a sea, even though a culture might do that. But for world building purposes, it's only a sea if the majority of it is encompassed by land. These are also important. They're also sources of food. Lakes are sources of drinking water. So it's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. How are the currents on your planet? It's important to know your currents because it's easy for ships to follow currents. If they're to come back and the current's really strong, it will bring warmer weather if it's going up a coast. It will maybe bring tropical rains up with it, like in the Northeast. We have the Gulf Stream that kind of goes along the Atlantic coast. It brings up very warm currents. However, for shipping purposes, it's difficult if they're sailbound ships because they have to sail against the current to go home. And if they row, it's even harder. You can tack through the wind on a sailboat, but if you don't have sails and you have to row, you're rowing into a current. That makes it really difficult. So there used to be this idea I believe it was from Yemen to India. When there was monsoon, they would actually catch the current back out. So the wind would help them get out to India, and then they could follow the current back. I believe that's the way it worked afterwards. So it created a lot of trade through there because of the weather in conjunction with the currents. Weather is very important. It will indicate where your dry spots are, where your wet spots are. Where there's wet spots, there are probably plant life. Depending on the sun and its color, will probably indicate what color the plants are going to be. Yellow is absorbed very easily into green. And since plants eat green on Earth, and we have a yellowish sun, it absorbs it very well into green. Not all plants are green. However, the predominant amount of plants are green because and I'm guessing here, I think it's the optimal color of the plant to absorb that spectrum of color. Now, the rating for today's episode, once again, is basic. Nothing too mind-boggling about this topic. So, something, once again, you need to do. You're starting to get into more detail, which will lead us right into the world-building task for the day, which is sketch out a basic map of your world. If you already have one, great. Look at it, review it, kind of go over and say, does it make sense where my geography is involved? But the bigger thing at this point is we'll get into those as we go in further into more episodes. However, for now is make sure you have a basic sketch of your world. And if you're a pen and paper person, create one, I would suggest, on graph paper and photocopy it. And if you want to, there are programs like Campaign Cartographer, which is one I use, which is great for people who aren't artists to create very realistic maps for your world, very detailed maps for your world. You need a beefy computer if you have a large scale that you're talking about. However, it is a wonderful way to interact with the world. So always have a map available for you. And sometimes you can zoom in or zoom out on your maps, but you need to basically know what your world looks like, because a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about later, when we talk about the world, we'll talk about it in a big scale, and then we'll zoom in on parts to get into more detail. The real world task for the day. Next time you're at work, call your significant other and say, hey, is there anything that you need for me to pick up on my way home? It could be groceries. It could be hardware. You don't care. If it's your wife, she might ask you for tampons. Don't blink. Just do it. It doesn't matter. It will cost you 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. It will make them exceptionally happy. Just help someone out in a simple way. Do it on your way home from work so you have a time frame to do it. Just give them a call. Is there anything that you need that I can do to help you to make your life better? Whether they live with you or not, they will be appreciative. The T's. The next episode, we will get into detail about Cosmos. I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, go to it. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I made. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.